Hey guys, welcome to Mr. Fincham's Fireside Follow-Alongs. This is going to be our first video here on our YouTube channel, and today we are starting with
Explorers, Triumphs and Troubles, written by Paul Mason.
So before we kind of jump into our new book here, let's take a moment to look at the title. Explorers, Triumphs and Troubles. Now, most of us know what an explorer is. An explorer is a person who explores. They go to different parts of the world and they search in areas that have not been looked at or have rarely been looked at. They explore new areas. Triumphs and troubles. Well, what is a triumph? A triumph is kind of like a success or a victory. If you play baseball and you win the championship, that is a triumph. You have triumphed over your opponents. And troubles. I think most of us know what troubles are. A trouble is like a problem or an obstacle or something that gets in our way. So today we are reading Explorers, Triumphs, and Troubles by Paul Mason, and we are going to be reading pages 4 to 11. One thing that I want you guys to keep in mind while we read is our question for today, Monday. In the blue boxes on page 7, the author discusses both positive and negative results of Marco Polo's explorations. What is a positive result? What is a negative result? Quote accurately from the text. So we are going to learn a little bit about Marco Polo and his explorations while he's exploring. What's a positive result? In other words, what's a triumph? And what is a negative result? In other words, what is a trouble? And you're going to be quoting accurately from the text as you answer that question. So, let's begin. Page 4. Explorers. Humans have always been explorers. Our earliest ancestors spread far and wide so that eventually people were living on every continent except Antarctica. The people who found these new lands were the first explorers. Well, why might humans live on every continent except Antarctica? Well, it's very cold. That's a good reason. Why explore? Explorers set off on their journeys for many different reasons. So people explore for a lot of different reasons, and we are going to look at those reasons now. The first one, looking for land. The first explorers were probably in search of new lands. As the number of humans on Earth grew, people began to look for new places to live. Route finding. Some explorers wanted to find a new route to a place they already knew about. Christopher Columbus, for example, was trying to find a new way to reach Asia when instead he stumbled across what we now call the Americas. So Christopher Columbus and all the people that lived back in those days, they knew about Asia. I mean, they knew where it was, roughly. They knew that it existed. They knew things about it. They had read about it, talked about it, heard about it. But they wanted to find a quicker way to get there. And that is one of the reasons why Christopher Columbus set out on his reason to explore. So some more reasons about why to explore. We're going to go to page 5. Another reason, hunting for wealth. Exploring is often dangerous, and sometimes it's deadly. The risk may be worthwhile if you get rich, though. The Spanish explorers of the 1500s who searched for South America's legendary Golden One, El Dorado, were examples of wealth seekers. They were looking to get rich. So you guys can notice the kind of the gold chest right here, filled with gold, right? People wanted to explore because they could get rich doing it. They could find gold. There is a video that we have for you guys as well on our YouTube channel about El Dorado, so keep that in mind. It's another thing to look at. It's kind of cool. Another reason why people would explore, down here in this section, fame and glory. Being the first to do something, climb Mount Everest or reach the South Pole, for example, meant you would be remembered in the history books. By the early 1900s, many of these firsts were being checked off by fame. Hungry explorers. So if you want to be famous, if you want all of that glory and recognition, one way to get it is to do something first. Go somewhere that has never been explored. The example they give is climbing Mount Everest. If you are the first person to climb Mount Everest, you will have fame and glory. And that is what some people want, which is another reason why they explored. So now let's move on to the next page here. Page 6. Let's talk a little bit about Asia. So, Marco Polo and the Silk Road. Imagine being just 17 years old and setting off for the other side of the world. Your dad, whom you only met 2 years ago, and your uncle are with you. The Polos traveled from Venice to China along the Silk Road. The route was named after the valuable Chinese silks that were traded along with it. So, here is China, right? And here is Beijing. This red line that you guys can follow here, this is known as the Silk Road, okay? The Silk Road to China. That 17-year-old was Marco Polo, and the year was 1271. Marco Polo and his companions were setting out from Italy on the Silk Road, an ancient trade route between Europe and China. After many adventures, they finally reached the Chinese Emperor Kublai Khan's palace in about 1275. Marco was a clever young man, and he eventually became Kublai Khan's advisor. Unlike other foreigners, Marco was allowed to travel throughout China. In fact, Kublai Khan found Marco's advice so useful that 17 years passed before he was allowed to return home to Italy. So Marco Polo ends up in China, and he meets the Emperor Khan, right? And he is an advisor, which means he gives advice. And Emperor Khan was so impressed with Marco Polo that he kept him around for 17 years. 17 years. That's a long time. And so now we are going to move on to page 7. Triumph. Marco Polo's book inspired traders to follow the Silk Road. The growth in trade brought wealth and new ideas to Europe, China, and places in between. So at this time, if you lived in China, you had maybe some goods to sell, maybe you had a business, you couldn't just put it on Amazon or put it on eBay and have somebody buy it, right? You had to find a way to actually get your product from where you live in China to the other side of the world. In order to do that, you need to have a route, a way to do it. And that's exactly what the Silk Road was. It was a way for people to trade things from all over the world. The travels of Marco Polo. When Marco Polo did get home, he found there was a war between his hometown of Venice and nearby Genoa. He was taken prisoner by the enemy. While he was in prison, he met a writer named Rustichelio da Pisa. Da Pisa wrote a book of Marco's experiences called The Travels of Marco Polo. The book told readers about the people and customs of China, and it was a hit throughout Europe. As a result, Marco Polo became one of the world's most famous explorers. So, Marco Polo gets home, right? There's a war going on. He's taken prisoner by the enemy. And as he's in prison, he meets this man named Mr. Da Pisa. And Da Pisa, after speaking with Marco Polo, decides to write a book about him. And this book is a big hit, and it makes Marco Polo famous, which is why, well, it's part of the reason why we know about him now. Let's take a look at the journey fact file here. The date, from 1271 to 1295. The length of the route, up to 6,200 miles, or 10,000 kilometers. That's how long it was. That's over 6,000 miles. That is a long route. If you wanted to go from one side of the road to the other, it would take you over a year. The dangers. Going from China to Europe on foot or with a wagon, maybe some sort of carriage, it's not going to be easy, right? There's a lot of dangers. So, some of the dangers that they encountered were bandits, wild animals, desert sandstorms, cold and snow in the mountains, hunger, and thirst. Or trouble. So notice at the top, this kind of links to the top. Triumph or trouble. China was a secretive place where foreigners were not allowed to travel freely. But the travels of Marco Polo told people all about China and its customs. Imagine how the people of China would have felt if their enemies had used this knowledge to attack them. So this book comes out, right, from Mr. Da Pisa, the Travels of Marco Polo. if you lived in China, you live in a place that's a little bit secretive. Not everybody knows about your customs and your culture. This book comes out, and it kind of tells people about that. Do you want your enemies to know about your culture, about what's important to you, about things about your facts about your town or facts about your country? Maybe not. Maybe not. All right, so let's go to page 8. Asia. And if you notice, there is some men up here. Looks like they're on horseback. Expedition to Tibet. And here's where we're starting. In 1903, a British expedition to Tibet set out from India, which at the time was ruled by Britain. Little was known about Tibet, as foreigners had been banned since the 1850s. Francis Younghusband led the expedition. Younghusband was not only an explorer, he was also an officer in the British Army, and he took 3,000 soldiers with him. So, here is India, right here. And the British, which ruled India at the time, are going to Tibet. So Younghusband decides to explore a route from India up to Tibet with 3,000 soldiers. Okay, that is a lot of people traveling on foot, on horseback, in a carriage. That's a long line of people. And we're going to read this little caption down here. By March 31st, 1904, the expedition reached Guru Pass to find 3,000 Tibetans blocking the way. So now they found a pass to get into Tibet. They have 3,000 soldiers, but now they find 3,000 Tibetans blocking their way. And here's the path here. Through the Himalayan mountains, the Guru Pass. So now let's move on to page 9. Reasons for the expedition. So why would Younghusband and the British, why would they go to Tibet? Why were they doing it in the first place? They packed up 3,000 soldiers. They brought supplies. They brought food. Why are they doing it, right? So reasons for the expedition. Officially, Younghusband was going to Tibet to discuss a trade agreement between British India and Tibet, and to explore the country. However, there was another reason for his journey. British authorities in India thought Russia wanted to control Tibet. The British thought Russia was sending weapons to Tibet that could be used to stage an attack on British India. So, Younghusband and the British, they want to go to Tibet and they want to talk about a trade agreement. They want to agree on trading goods, right? And they're also worried that the Russians were sending weapons to Tibet and that the people of Tibet would use those weapons against the British. So they wanted to go there to try to smooth that over or to stop it. That was another reason. And let's take a look down here. Explorers become invaders. The Tibetans did not want the British Army in their country. They saw the British expedition as an invasion, which was what it soon became. To stop the British, Tibetan forces tried to block the road to the capital Lhasa, and the Tibetans were armed with old-fashioned weapons. Instead of turning back, as peaceful explorers would have done, the British army opened fire with guns. The conflict was not balanced. Hundreds of Tibetans were killed, but very few British soldiers died. So, they're exploring, right? The British say they're exploring. If you're an explorer, do you take 3,000 armed soldiers with you to explore? I'm not so sure. Maybe, you could still explore with that, right? But 3,000 soldiers, it sounds like maybe they had more than exploring in mind, right? So the journey fact file. Date, 1903 to 1904. The distance, 223 miles, or 350 kilometers, in a straight line from Gangtok to Lhasa, much farther on foot. The numbers, about 10,000 people, including 3,000 soldiers. The dangers, attack by Tibetan forces, freezing temperatures, snow and ice, altitude sickness. So apart from the wild animals and the people of Tibet maybe fighting back against you, they also had to endure freezing temperatures. Remember, a lot of the places that they passed through were mountain towns, and it could get really cold. And here is a picture of a Tibetan town down here. All right, and we are going to go to the next page. Page 10. Asia. Scorched earth. The Tibetans began to realize that they could not fight off the British with their powerful weapons. Instead, they began a scorched earth campaign where they destroyed anything the British might find useful. Villages were deserted, supplies were carried away and hidden, and crops were burned. The Tibetans thought that with nothing to eat, the British would go away, but this was not successful. The British had brought supplies with them, and they were able to fish in Tibet's lakes and hunt wild animals. So here's another little map of the route that they took. So, again, the first sentence of this says, the Tibetans began to realize that they could not fight off the British and their powerful weapons. So the British had more technology than the Tibetans, right? And what were the British worried about? They were worried that the Tibetans would get more technology, more weapons from Russia. So they wanted to put an end to that. Scorched earth. If you own farms and somebody is going to take over your town and your farms, you might burn your farms so that way whoever takes over your town won't have food to eat and they'll leave, right? But it did not work for the Tibetans. And we are going to go on to the last page here for today, page 11. Triumph. Leading the expedition across icy plains and through high mountain passes showed great leadership skills, as Younghusband was a patriot trying to keep British India safe. He showed the Tibetans that siding with Russia was a bad idea. A trade agreement. The British finally reached the Tibetan capital Lhasa on August 3rd, 1904, by which time all the Tibetan leaders had fled in fear. Younghusband forced junior Tibetan officials to sign an agreement that said the British could trade in Tibet. It also said Tibet had to pay reparations to make up for attacking the expedition. Until they were paid, the British would occupy part of Tibet's territory. Or trouble. And again, these kind of link together. Notice the thumbs up for triumph, and then the thumbs down for trouble. The Russia plan to control Tibet never existed, so the expedition was pointless. Even at the time, Younghusband was criticized for using powerful weapons against untrained, poorly armed Tibetans. Buildings were torn down, crops ruined, and part of the country was occupied. So, the British are successful in their attempt to, quote, explore and occupy Tibet. So now they are there. They are occupying Tibet. They are basically living there, and they kind of took it over. So before we close out for today's readings, I'm going to scroll back to page 7 real quick. And the question that we had in mind for page 7 was, in the blue boxes on page 7, so here is the first one, triumph and or trouble. The author discusses both positive, good, and negative, bad, results of Marco Polo's explorations. What is a positive result? What is a negative result? Quote accurately from the text. There is also a writing response to this. I really want to know what you guys think about this after reading our book today. So here is our writing question, and you guys can find this on the ELA questions and tasks part under Monday. Exploring can be a dangerous and tiring adventure, but it can also be very fun. You can learn about interesting cultures, taste new foods, and meet new people. If you could spend a year exploring a different country, which country would it be and why? What would you want to explore about the country? So that's going to be your writing response. The extension. There is an extension may do here as well. And I'll read that question for you guys quickly before we close out. According to the author, what are the 4 main reasons of exploration? So the author gives some reasons why people explore in the first place. What are the 4 main reasons? And you will also find a video about Marco Polo under the extension may do as well. So thank you guys for following along. I really am excited to hear and read about what you guys write back. And if you guys have any questions, as always, remember to email me or write me on Seesaw. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you for following along.